Hello, everybody, and a great big warm Lane 4 welcome to all of you out there listening to this webinar. It's going to be on maintaining well-being in an uncertain world today. Just before we begin, a reminder to use the chat function for any questions throughout the webinar. We'll be live for around about 30 minutes. We will hang around towards the end to take any extra questions we've got. We'll attempt to answer whatever questions you have as we go along, but please do feel free to submit them, and if we can't answer, we'll respond after with an email going out to all of our attendees. And a final note: the webinar will be recorded, so please feel free to suggest to any friends, colleagues that you think might find this useful afterwards. They'll be able to find it on the Lane web. So nice to have you all here. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Andrew Gillespie. I'm a senior consultant and a business psychologist that works for Lane 4. And well-being is a fascinating topic for me, for a number of reasons, really. First of all, I'm the chair of a steering group we've got at Lane 4 called Mind 4. We look after and provide support around mental health and well-being in the organisation, Lane 4. And I also work with people in my practice as a psychologist, supporting their well-being and helping them to support their people's well-being as leaders. And finally, I've had various challenges with my own mental health throughout my life, and I'm passionate about promoting well-being and promoting dialogue around people's mental health. I think it's a really, really important thing. I'm really delighted also to be joined by my colleague Alison Maitland. She's our Director of Research and Product at Lane 4.
Hi.
Hi, Alison. So great to have you. So what makes this such an interesting topic to you?
Andrew, I think firstly it's because I'm a human being in the midst of all of this. So I think that's my starting point, that I'm going through this like anybody else is going through. But also I'm a line manager trying to help my team think about how we manage things like furlough and finances and so on. I'm also a health professional psychologist. I work in sport, in netball, and I have a lot of athletes who I'm trying to help work through their well-being at the moment as they're sitting on the bench, not being able to do what they do day to day. And then lastly, with my sort of Lane 4 hat on, I'm Research and Product Development Director. So we've been spending a year trying to really look at some new insight that will help people with their well-being. So part of that is sharing some of that today.
Brilliant, and great to have you sharing your nuggets of wisdom throughout the next half hour with our audience. So today we're going to be talking about these three objectives here. So first of all, talking about why we think well-being is such an important thing for us at home and in the workplace, and indeed for most of us, those two places have merged quite considerably over the last couple of weeks. We'll be sharing some strategies which are designed to help people to improve their own well-being, and also hopefully helping to empower people to make choices to do things differently in order to cope with this new environment. And so I'm going to quickly just take a quick look at this slide. This is our Lane 4 office at the moment. It's looking pretty empty at the moment. Some of you may have seen this already if you've attended different webinars, but it's certainly a sign of changed times. I'm going to ask a really obvious sounding question, but Alice, why is this so relevant at the moment?
Yeah, I think really you'd need to be from outer space not to know why well-being and resilience is vital at this time. And I think that there are three core reasons why protecting well-being and improving resilience needs to be at the top of our list. The first one is the coronavirus pandemic. It's put stresses on all aspects of our work and home life than we've ever experienced before. And the first thing is we need to be able to predict how this is going to impact on our employees and our own well-being. And there was a recent article published by The Lancet, a meta-analysis, that looked at people who've been isolated in previous epidemics to really find out what stress might be predictive of a psychological impact on them as a result. And there are things like a real fear of infection or not knowing how long they were going to be isolated, things like frustration and boredom, wanting to know some more information, not having enough information, how they get supplies, and as the isolation came to an end, moving through to a real worry about finances and a fear of being stigmatized for infecting or being infected themselves. So that's the first thing, is to be able to predict what's going to be happening for our employees. The second one, I think, is being able to need to respond to people's real experiences. From the feedback you've given us from conversations and through Mentimeter, we know that you and your employees need help with stress and worry, with handling uncertainty, with knowing how to live at home, and particularly that thing about balancing how to be at home feeling relaxed with the sudden rush of anxiety that comes as you look after yourself, and not only looking after your own well-being, but trying to look after the well-being of other people too. I think finally, one of the reasons to pay attention to this is that we can benefit from cutting through the noise on well-being. There is so much advice, so many tips, articles, all sorts of videos, clips, and so on out there. And it's really hard to know what to do. And in fact, actually, that in itself can be quite overwhelming, and so overwhelming that we end up doing nothing. So Andrew and I are hoping to give you a simple way to cut through all of that noise.
Lovely, thank you very much, Alison. And so we mentioned the word well-being, and I guess that can mean lots of different things to people. But what do you mean when we're talking about well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my lovely academic definition and then try and bring it to life with an example. So from an academic point of view, it's something about a dynamic state where you're able to maximize your physical, your mental, and your social functioning so that you can live a full, satisfying and productive life. And let me give you an example just to bring that to life. And actually, I've got one from this morning. So probably like many of you, we have a daily morning catch-up call in our team now that we don't see each other. And this morning, it started light-hearted like it always does. There's some jokes and a story about one of the members of the team who was having to do an improvised biology lesson with a 4-year-old on the bed at 7 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, it was very light-hearted and there was banter. But then we went round the team and we started sharing what we were most and least grateful for in the previous day. And suddenly, from nowhere, the real experiences surged to the top. So whilst we felt we had a really stable feeling of well-being, suddenly that shifted. It was dynamic. And we got out some of the real fears and concerns that people had. So fear of furloughing, worrying about people who were ill, who were close to us, not knowing what would happen tomorrow, let alone the next week. So our state of well-being shifted in an instant. It was totally dynamic. And then, of course, what we did was try and focus on the things that were important to us, things that will bring about a full, satisfying and productive life, or as full and satisfying and productive as we can do at the moment. And then we looked at then how we would deal with it mentally, physically, and in the context of our environment, so that mind-body environment focus to all of that. So that's how I make sense of well-being, Andrew.
It's quite interesting. I sometimes think that it's easier to define well-being by the absence of it rather than the presence of it. And from a personal perspective, I can find that so my sense of well-being is less great, particularly as times when my anxiety gets spiked, and often that relates to uncertainty for me. So it's a funny one. I don't mind change so much, but as long as I have a stable base to work from, and at the moment that kind of stable base has been quite threatened, and I guess that's down to two things. So the first is coronavirus itself, the actual illness, and its consequences on people's health. I'm not so concerned personally about that. I'm fortunate to fit into a relatively privileged category at the moment for that. But for the people around me, my wife, she has parents who would fit into the vulnerable category. My parents are pushing on a bit these days as well. I'm sure they'll be glad of hearing me say that if they're listening. But we have worries about the other people around us, and that sense of concern for each other is quite contagious. But I guess what's more impactful for me is the vast and sweeping changes that coronavirus has brought to society at the moment. And suddenly I found myself working from home, finding it hard to find ways to entertain myself, because of the weekends, and all of this in the backdrop of my own well-being. I have a number of different strategies that I use to help myself feel at my best or to feel well, and all of that's threatened at the moment. It's very difficult to get on with normal life, and so the preoccupation with all these sort of different things that are going on, all these changes and all these potential threats that we might have, is actually well, for me, in my personal experience, is taking me away from living that full, satisfying and productive life. I'm not quite sure how to do that in this context. It makes life a little bit difficult. So I guess that's my version of it. But Alison, so speaking as a psychologist, then, how would you make sense of this, all of this that's going on?
Yeah, one psychologist to another. It's always dangerous, Andrew, to have two psychologists in a room or virtually in a room.
Very dangerous indeed.
Yeah, I like to use a picture that our colleague Rick Cockgreave uses, and it's on the screen now. And he talks about that we all have the capacity to have both good and bad days. And on a good day, we can all operate from a place of well-being. And it's a bit like the paler blue circle right in the middle of the picture on the screen. And that's where we feel psychologically safe. We can connect with others. We can be our authentic selves. It's a real place of growth. It's very easy to get pulled out of that state of well-being, particularly now. It's so easy to get knocked from that place of equilibrium. So imagine that our optimum state is in the middle. We can get triggered to the left or the right. In other words, we get pulled out of shape either way. And there are two ways. The reason we go to the left or the right, there are two ways that we tend to get pulled out of our state of well-being. One is when we respond to that pull, being pulled out, by going on attack. I'm sure many of you have colleagues who are angry at people right now. So we can position ourselves when we get pulled in that direction as being greater than those around us. That's that shift to the right. But we can also get pulled to the left, and that's where we might respond to something which makes us want to withdraw or hide away. So we become less than ourselves. And so either way, what we're trying to do is either have some strategies that put us back into that state of well-being. Those are the darker, the royal blue arrows on the picture. Or otherwise, we want to try and stay in that state of well-being for longer. Those are the lighter blue arrows, where we're trying to stay and expand that circle of well-being so we can be there for longer and make that a bigger part of our lives. So either way, we're trying to either stay in that circle of well-being or get ourselves back into it. What about you, Andrew? How do you make sense of it?
Yes, very good question, Alison. I find myself going back to some old school psychology in recent times, and what we got here is an image of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I think this comes from like the 50s, and I haven't used this for some time until recently. But I guess as a business psychologist, I spend a lot of time working with people who are leaders and people who are working in an environment where they have the luxury of being able to deal with the top part of this particular sort of pyramid or triangle. So they spend their time dealing with things like trying to be better at what they do, trying to promote themselves, trying to achieve status, trying to spread good practice or goodwill to other people. And they're living in that kind of space around esteem and in fact self-actualization as well. So the idea of kind of self-expression or full self-expression. But what's happening at the moment is a lot more of the fundamental stuff that we often take for granted is really getting challenged. So some examples of that might be physiological needs like eating. And it's difficult to get the kind of food that we want to get these days sometimes, particularly if you live in areas where the supermarkets have been raided. So that's an example of something which suddenly starts to get quite threatened for people. Or people's health has been threatened. So the idea that if we leave our houses, then we could possibly be infected. Suddenly there's this kind of the possibility or the option that our own health and security in that way could be impacted. Equally well, the sense of isolation or not being able to be around our loved ones or losing that sense of belonging is a big one. I can speak from personal experience about that one. When I found I was working from home, I went into a sudden panic about the fact that I wasn't going to be able to speak to my colleagues every day. I wasn't going to have a place to go. It was a big threat. When any of these things are threatened, just much as some of the things in the top part of the pyramid or the hierarchy get threatened, so things like status are threatened, or our control and autonomy over the world get threatened. Some of these more basic needs get threatened. We still have that immediate kind of response to the fight or flight. Going into those two circles that you just been talking about there, Alison. I think the other thing to say about that is for many people, we're not used to talking about that at work. We're not used to talking about our feelings. We're not used to talking about vulnerabilities. particularly the leadership amongst us, often feel we ought to project an air of professionalism or control over our world around us, which means not sharing our vulnerabilities. And often we see it as not okay to share those kinds of things. Particularly difficult for senior leaders who at the moment, I guess, want to be able to project the sense of we've got it under control, everything's okay, we're going to be fine. Well, they might not actually be feeling fine in this moment. So I think what's really important is to acknowledge that these kinds of emotions and feelings that we have at the moment are actually quite normal. Most of us are going through some kind of change at the moment, serious change at the moment. Trying to feel pretty uncomfortable, to be honest. So what I'm going to do is move on to ask Alison then. What can we do to deal with that kind of discomfort? How do we look after well-being in the present moment?
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. And I think you've probably answered Patrick's question. Patrick, you asked how do you get people to discuss their well-being if they aren't able to let you in? I think Andrew's probably given you one of the answers we would give, which is to model it yourself, to actually show your vulnerability and to ask those questions and to share where you're at the moment. And I think Andrew will talk a little bit more about that when we come on to some of the tips. So it's a great question. So Andrew, you asked me, how do we manage that discomfort? How do we look after our well-being? Well, I think what we're trying to do, as we said at the beginning, is cut through the noise and try and simplify. And when you look at the research, whichever model you look at, broadly, you can group well-being resilient strategies into 3 buckets. It's about how we manage our mind, it's about how we manage our body, and it's about how we manage our environment or the context of the social setting. So making sure you've boiled things down to mind, body, and environment enables you to focus on taking action, so you're not caught like a rabbit in the headlights. And I think, Andrew, you and I are going to share some strategies from each of these 3 buckets right now, aren't we, to help people cut through that noise? So if I start with mind, one of the most important things that I found, particularly in working as a psychologist and working in sport, is getting people to accept their emotions. As we begin to have feelings and thoughts that are uncomfortable, our fight or flight instincts kick in, and our mind actually wants to push away the worry and the anxiety and the feelings that are going on for us. That it could be we're not good enough, we're afraid, there'll be all sorts of things that are going on in our heads and our bodies. We're okay when we're feeling good, and we want to avoid feeling bad. But whilst we might try and avoid feeling bad, we might think that's the intuitive right thing to do, the science tells us that doesn't actually help us with our well-being. There's some really good research from a group of psychologists at George Mason University, led by Todd Kashdan, and they've done a whole range of studies looking at how people respond, and they found that everybody has periods of joy and periods of sadness. So even if you're anxious at the moment, you're not anxious all of the time. You will have periods of joy and of happiness. So for example, when you connect with people or you get some good feedback or something, you do something important for yourself. But what the research tells us is that if we habitually avoid doing the things that lead to difficult thoughts and feelings, we then can't sustain any emotional highs for as long as other people who actually do lean in and make room for the uncomfortableness, the anxiety, and the sadness. So actually, what we need to do when good things happen is we need to go with that. And also when difficult things happen, we also need to lean into that. And I use the term about sort of turning down the struggle switch. So if I were to ask you, Andrew, at the moment, if there was a switch that was like a dial with a scale of 0 to 10, and 10 is a full-on struggle with uncomfortable thoughts and feelings right now, and 0 was no struggle at all, then right now, what level are you?
It's funny you said this earlier today, and I said that too. And now that I'm presenting to a webinar of over 200 people, it's maybe a 4 or 5, I'd say, at the moment.
Okay, so one of the things we can do is just drop that struggle switch. It's not pushing our thoughts and feelings away, but it's just letting go of the struggle and letting those thoughts and feelings come and go. So even if you're listening now, and Andrew, you can do it, let's just try and turn that down a notch or two and just let the uncomfortableness, I'm a little bit anxious too presenting now, just letting that flow through me and go, we're all here together trying to do a good thing and do the right thing for our employees. So that's my first tip in terms of mind.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. And I guess to my view of that is it's inevitable that we're all going to be feeling some kind of anxiety at various points in our life. I guess at the moment, even more so. And I mentioned before, I have my own mental health struggles from time to time, and I work with a therapist on a fairly regular basis. One of the things we talk about is instead of asking the question or sort of having the sense of how do I get rid of this sense of anxiety, or how do I show off that I can be as strong as possible, and it's changing the question and saying to ourselves, okay, I feel anxious and that's okay. It's right to feel anxious. Now, how do I want to be whilst I'm feeling this way? What choices do I want to make now that I'm feeling anxious? So an example of that I've been doing recently, I've been I don't know what you call it, building jigsaws, putting jigsaws together. And while I'm doing that, I might feel anxious, but then I can still make the choice to focus my energy and focus my attention on the jigsaw rather than focus my energy on the struggle with my thoughts and feelings, trying to get rid of that. I guess another thing that I've found has been helpful is focusing actually on what hasn't changed rather than what has changed. So it helps me to feel a lot more grounded. So a lot of what's going on at the moment is actually really it's coming from the external world. So we're getting the news is telling us stuff basically that this stuff's not okay. It might be involved in work, which are telling us we can and can't do things, and of course we have to abide by the rules from the government and things like that. But we have a choice. We have a choice over what it is we focus on, and we have a choice over what reality we create in our own minds. And by focusing on what hasn't changed, then actually it can help us to feel a little bit more stabilised. So as I look out of my study window at the moment, I can see the street that I live on, and there are daffodils out that have been there for weeks, and there's the signs of spring coming along, and the houses that I'm used to being there are still there, and there's wheelie bins out on the street, and all those things. There's lots of normal things that you're able to focus on, and by that kind of sense of reframing the world a little bit, then it can make it feel a little bit less threatening. I guess a final point that I had been thinking on is this one around dealing with a lack of motivation, and it's the other side of it. So, when I've been dealing with anxiety or quite heightened in motivation, I try and tackle or try and get away from as feeling in front of yourself. But when the anxiety dissolves away and there's not actually much to do, some of us are caught in this kind of state of bit of sort of ennui, and we often wait for motivation to come to us, and there's a sort of common misconception that motivation leads to action, whereas in actual fact, a lot of clinical psychologists will say that action leads to motivation. So an example of that could be me thinking, well, there's no point in me mowing the lawn, I can't be bothered, no one's going to see it. But actually, if I go and mow the lawn, I might start mowing the lawn and noticing that some of the flower beds need looking after. I need to do a bit of weeding and get a good idea in my head to go and do that kind of thing. So actually, choosing to opt into things can be helpful. And the question that can help in our own minds that can help is one about saying, if I do this, or if I did this, would I be glad that I'd done it rather than not doing it? And that's the simple question. So not even would I be glad I'd done this rather than something else. Would I be glad that I've done this compared to not doing it? And that can sometimes help to breed some sense of motivation to do certain tasks in our lives, which start to bring us back in line a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to move on, and we're going to talk about the body now. So Alison, tell us a bit about sleep hygiene.
Yeah, I just have one body suggestion. So we know that using our body to look after well-being involves making sure that we're active and that we're fueling up with the right food and drink. So we know that. But for some of us in this very strange working environment, the challenge is actually making sure we recover by getting enough good quality sleep, because it's not easy to maintain those good sleep habits, particularly if we're at home all the time and we don't have the routine of having to go into the office, or maybe if you're furloughed, which I'm sure some people on the call will be. And if you're not convinced how important sleep is for well-being, let me share a couple of salutary facts from the research. So senior surgeons who get less than 6 hours sleep are shockingly 170% more likely to commit a serious surgical error than if they'd had a full night's sleep. Now, I know you won't be a surgeon on this call, you're busy saving lives, and I'm incredibly grateful for all that the NHS and everyone who works there is doing. And for the rest of us, though, there are still impacts of not having enough sleep. So if we don't get that, our listening is worse by 57%. How we relate to others is reduced by 38%. And our ability to solve problems goes down by 57%. And as my family can attest to, I'm sure, when we don't get enough sleep, strong emotions like anger and frustration are more likely to be triggered. So good sleep hygiene is really important at this time. And you know all those things. This is about creating a habit of doing it. It's about a consistent bedtime, reducing your caffeine 4 hours before you go to bed, reducing your alcohol 2 hours before you go to bed, removing electronic devices in the bedroom to reduce glare, and taking the light in the bedroom down to as much as you can do, and keeping your room at a good temperature. So I know you know all those things. This is about, to maintain our well-being, is getting to the habit of keeping that good routine of good sleep hygiene.
Great, thank you, Alison. And the last area about environment, I guess, is the last point you talked about. And I'm going to share a couple of things from my perspective here. I guess the image behind the grey box portrays three people in the foreground with a big wide world out there. And I'm really talking about what's going on in the foreground. The relationships between these people is a big thing. And it's an interesting one. My other half has started training as a Samaritan recently, and she was on a sort of training shift where she and her mentor took on 9 phone calls between the two of them, 6 of which were about coronavirus. And of those 6, I was really surprised to learn that all 6 were not about the threat of the illness, they weren't about family members or anything like that. It was purely about isolation. 6 out of 6 calls related to coronavirus were about isolation. And I think at the moment, a really important thing is to continue building and reaching out and connecting with other people. But not only that, I think in the context of our own well-being, we can use those relationships to help us feel better. And I've been surprised from a personal perspective when I think I mentioned earlier that the threat of isolation for me at work was a big one. I tapped up a few colleagues and said, I'm feeling a bit worried about this. And the next day I had 4 phone calls from colleagues. The next day I had another 2. All just checking in on me, checking I was okay, and the lift that gave me was enormous. People cared about me, and I knew I wasn't on my own if I was suffering from my own anxieties. So there's something really big there about just reaching out to people and letting them know how you feel. It's not a big deal, and you might be surprised at how people respond. The second bit here, and this is in the outside world, is just get outside and see the horizon. I was speaking to a colleague, this fabled Rick that we were talking about before. He was talking to me saying there's some research saying that if you can just see the horizon, it actually makes a difference to your well-being, and it literally expands your own horizon, so you can start feeling like the world is a greater place and something you can get involved in. So it's a very trite piece of advice, but really encourage you all to go outside and find wide open spaces, because it makes a very big difference to our lives. So we're just about to wrap up. I'm just going to ask Alison to quickly summarise a recap on what we've covered in the last 30 minutes, and then we'll deal with any questions we've got.
Great. I can see there are questions coming through already. So very quickly, there are 3 reasons why we need to have well-being at the top of our agenda. 1, so we can anticipate that psychological impact for people around us. The second is to understand people's real experiences. So that great question, I think, from Patrick, about how do you get people to discuss their well-being? Yep, you start talking to them and understanding and asking and modelling it. And then thirdly, so that we can cut through the noise so people are not overwhelmed by the information and can actually take some action. And Andrew and I shared how we make sense of well-being. So knowing that it's dynamic, it's a state that changes. You don't have to be there all the time. And really understanding that there's a huge threat to us at the moment from those real fundamental needs such as financial and physical well-being. So we are going to get pulled out of that circle of well-being. We need these strategies to put us back there. So in cutting through the noise, we've suggested that you get people to focus on the 3 buckets. What can they do for their mind, their body, and in the environment and the context? And we just gave you a few key strategies to think over for now. So for the mind, to drop that struggle with our emotions and make room for those highs and lows, to focus on what's not changed and to take action on what's important. For our body, just get into those habits. Habit is the key of good sleep hygiene. And for environment, to reach out to combat isolation and share. And then my favourite, actually, Andrew, is that get outside and see the horizon. I'm going to be using that one.
Lovely, thank you, Alison. So I just want to acknowledge a couple of questions here. I know that we're kind of very close to wrapping up, but in particular, there's somebody asking to please explain self-actualization. That was David. That's the simple idea of self-actualization is it's there's a lot of work done by Maslow some time ago when he was doing his research on a lot of people who've achieved the absolute pinnacle of self-expression of their abilities. So people like Wolfgang Mozart or Einstein, for example, and he found that they were fully able to express themselves and to push themselves to the limits of what they might be capable of. So that's really what self-actualization is about. It's about realizing everything you possibly could about yourself and sort of fully unleashing your personal potential. The idea is it's actually quite rare for people to fully achieve that, but it's something that many of us want to do. But we don't tend to get to that until we've managed to secure the rest of our needs further down in the hierarchy. So that answers that question. And then the last one, Alison, I don't know whether you want to take a stab at this, about how do we let some of these feelings drift away? So how do you allow the negative emotions to drift away? Is there something practical you can do for that?
Yeah, there certainly is. So one thing I use with the athletes I work with, we often first we locate where the feelings are in our body, because they're usually somewhere in our body, and we understand. We take a look at where they are, how big they are, whether they're moving, whether there's a colour to them. We start to just really personify what that feeling is and get a sense of it. And always, 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 that feeling is smaller than our sense of who we are. It's a part of us. So that's a starting point to understand that our feelings don't overwhelm us. Actually, we can locate them somewhere, and there's usually an outside to them and a shape to them. And once we've done that, then we actually start to make some space for them. So we breathe around them and we take a breath in and we imagine the breath going around those thoughts and feelings. And then you can start to get a sense of they're there. And actually, as Andrew said, I can carry on doing what I need to do today and take those feelings with me. I'm not pushing them away. I'm not getting rid of them. I'm just making space for them and accepting them. I might be curious about them. And then I'm going to get on with those things that are important. So it's a very quick whistle stop tours about how I work with athletes with that.
Thank you, Alison. There's so many other questions coming through. We'd love to be able to answer all of them, but mindful many of you will be wanting to get off the line and you'll have other things booked in. I'm just going to wrap up, but I promise we will get back to you after this webinar and share some of our responses to these questions. Just a couple of points. First of all, we are doing some research into well-being at the moment in terms of the current COVID-19 epidemic and how people are responding to that. If you have 10 minutes to take the question, I would be really, really grateful. Colleagues just popped the link in the chat box there. So please, if you have a moment, take that, have a go at it, and then we'll be contacting throughout at three-week intervals to find out how you're getting on. Another couple of points. There will be another webinar next week on centered more on supporting team well-being. So how do I, as a manager, support the well-being of my team members, especially during this difficult time? And finally, just keep your eyes out for us on social media. There's lots more webinars, lots more content being generated in and around this topic and various other topics to do with leadership in this challenging time. So keep your eyes out and look in all the different social media channels, and we'll look forward to hearing again from you guys soon. And all the best. Take care.